Okay, so we're now moving on to chapter 2 of Dracula. Please remember the assumption is you've read the chapter. I'm not reading it with you. We're just going to be picking up quotes and ideas that perhaps come through. So chapter 2 basically explores how Jonathan Harker meets Count Dracula, how he assists him with his plans, because remember Dracula wants to move to England. How he notices Dracula has no reflection, and finally how he realizes that he is a prisoner. So when we look at chapter 2, obviously it's the 5th of May. So it's the idea that it's a continuation, and that's what it says at the beginning of the chapter, that this is Jonathan Harker's journal. It's continued. So it's continuing from the previous chapter. Remember that his journal is the idea that you wouldn't stop reading, you would carry on reading. Okay, so when we look at the beginning, it says, I must have been asleep. So again, we are constantly reminded of the idea that sleep is a very significant, very important motif within the text. And he goes on to describe this remarkable place. So he describes the castle, and he uses words like gloom, he uses dark, he uses arches. So what do we need to gather from this? Stoker is making use of conventional Gothic settings. Not only has he stuck with tradition and he has put the story into an isolated ruined castle, we also have a very detailed description. Okay, so we realize that Jonathan Harker is very impressed with the castle. He describes it as remarkable. It's huge, it's dark, it's abandoned, which of course brings us again to the whole idea of isolation. Now, as we read through this, note again that the diary entry is extremely detailed and the description is extremely detailed, much like the previous entries in chapter 1. And in a way, this is comforting to the reader. It's the style we've come to associate with Jonathan, and we know that we're seeing things through Jonathan's eyes. And it's allowing for the slow build-up, which is necessary because the action is going to certainly start coming in quite vividly towards the end of chapter 3, and we need to have the slow build-up in order for us to be shocked. So we've got this idea of isolation. Okay, we've got, and all the words, as you can see, the adjectives such as gloom and the nouns dark and arches are looking at the semantic field associated with the Gothic setting. And then he says when the carriage stopped and the driver jumped down and held out his hand to assist me to alight, and Jonathan says again, I could not but notice his prodigious strength. Now there's a lot of repetition. Please note that we have already heard in the previous chapter about this amazing strength of the driver. Physical strength in this is very, very important. Okay, and we need to be reminded of it throughout the text. In fact, he goes on to describe the hand being like a steel vice, that it could have crushed mine if he'd chosen. And of course, this is a sense of foreshadowing, because we know that Count Dracula is going to attempt to crush Jonathan. He is going to use Jonathan for a time while he is useful, and then he is going to crush him, maybe not physically, but certainly mentally and emotionally. Jonathan describes how the coach driver took out my traps as luggage, and placed them on the ground, and he says, as I stood close to a great door, old and studded with large iron nails, and set in a projecting doorway of massive stone. So we get the size of this castle. It's so huge, it's vast, it's dark, it's isolated, and it gives us and Jonathan this impression of the amazing power that Count Dracula holds. It's this enormous amount of control. He has this huge house, but at the same time, if you notice, it's starting to crumble, and it talks about things, the carvings that have been worn by time and weather. Okay, he is starting to, in terms of his power and control in Transylvania, is starting to wane. Some critics talk about it as the idea of the aristocracy and the way things were run using serfdom, and specifically the kind of idea of a chief and peasants, and being run in a very aristocratic kind of way, almost like feudal England. It seems to imply that perhaps this is coming to an end. This idea of rule that was in Eastern Europe at this time is crumbling. It's coming to an end, and new ways of ruling and new ideas, like in London, where it's more democratic, are needed. So there is that idea that this is the implication. Notice, though, that Jonathan stood in silence where I was, and I did not know what to do. Okay, so we've got this castle that represents the past, and represents quite an oppressive past, and one that is ruled with violence. We've got studded with large iron nails, and things are made of stone. It's very kind of cold, and we've got this man who represents the progressive west of London standing in front of this door, and he is unsure of what to do. He is unable to comprehend what is going before him. So the castle's representing this past, and he's representing the modern world, and it's this idea that there is going to be conflict, and Jonathan doesn't know how to get in. He doesn't know how to start. He's isolated. He's unable to enter. He says he can't find a bell or a knocker. He doesn't know how to get in. Okay, he's unable to gain entrance, and maybe this is again also a suggestion and foreshadowing that nobody can get in, but at the same time nobody can get out. So once he is in, how does he get out? And as we know, he is kept prisoner for quite a while. Notice that the driver has left, the driver has disappeared, and at no time does the driver and Count Dracula appear together. So again, it reinforces the suggestion that they're one and the same, and the idea that Dracula has no servants and that he's doing everything himself again implies that he can't find servants, because what would he do with them? As we know, he would consume them. Okay. So we've got this again back to the idea of he stood in silence. He had no idea of how to enter. Interestingly, according to folklore, and you'll see with this, vampires are unable to enter your home. If you've all watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer and other such vampire movies, the individual, the owner of the home, has to invite the vampire in. And so you can't go in without permission. Perhaps the fact that this is reverted and Jonathan is unable to go in without permission could perhaps suggest his hidden desires. He is repressed, and he is unable to act on his desires. He's unable to enter this castle. Now again, in terms of Christianity, when one gets to heaven, the righteous are able to enter heaven through the pearly gates. You have immediate entrance. So that perhaps this is implying that Jonathan might not be righteous, or the fact that these are the gates to hell and righteousness is not significant, and maybe Jonathan is too righteous and therefore now is unable to gain entrance. I'll leave that for you to think about. But note how the castle is personified with frowning walls and dark opening windows, and we have this man standing there, this rational, logical man who feels doubtful and fearful. I felt doubts and fears, and as soon as he feels like this, so too does the reader, because we have become, as I said, we've become accustomed to Jonathan and his way of writing, and we now are feeling those feelings that he is having. And he says they're crowding, and he's secluded in this place, and it's isolated, and he's really unsure of where to go first. He describes it as a grim adventure. Okay, and he says, what sort of grim adventure was it on which I had embarked? This rhetorical question shows he's beginning to question the wiseness of this trip. Should he have done this? He was so excited right at the beginning. He was going to go and see all these different places. It was a great opportunity, but now even he is beginning to question whether this was such a good idea. And he goes on to talk about being a solicitor's clerk sent out to explain the purchase of London estate to a foreigner. And he says, solicitor's clerk? He is no longer a solicitor's clerk. He's intimidated by this huge edifice where he stands and the fact that he's unable to get an entrance. And he's actually reminding himself, I'm no longer a solicitor's clerk. I'm no longer a nobody. Because he has become a solicitor. So he has passed his exams. He is now a member of the middle class, or he has always been, but he's not working class. He's a man who has achieved, and he's reminding himself as he stands here not to be intimidated by this grim adventure, because he's actually very capable. And we see, because he's obviously passed all his examinations. He says there, I got word my examination was successful, and now I am a full-blown solicitor. So he's plucking up the courage. He's trying to say, look, I can do this. Maybe a bit of an aside at this point is that we need to explore Victorian society and social class. Now, obviously, in England, we still have aspects of class, although they're not as defined as what they used to be. But Victorian society was certainly divided into three distinct classes. You had the upper class, the middle class, and the working class. So the upper class were the aristocrats, the nobles, and often wealthy families. They tended to be very powerful and have greater authority. And in Victorian society would have regarded them as the moral, trustworthy. They were gentlemen, and I say gentlemen in inverted commas because it's the idea that that was what they were supposed to be. Often their titles were inherited, and many aristocrats hadn't worked for centuries. You also tended to find that the aristocrats and the nobility tended to be better educated because obviously they had the money. Middle class, in Victorian era, the middle class was very prosperous. It was a really prosperous time, and this class grew during this era. Remember, the Industrial Revolution had a huge impact, so there were greater opportunities, there was better pay, better education, and people were therefore able to move up and get good jobs. And again, this is where Jonathan would have been slotted in. You would also have the working class, and that would be further divided into skilled and unskilled. And it's what the Count would refer to as the peasants. So we'll look at that in a little bit. But this class tended to remain quite aloof. They weren't as involved in the political progress, and they tended to be slightly more hostile towards the middle and upper class. I think what we need to realize here, though, is that Count Dracula would automatically be an aristocrat. So Jonathan is going to trust him and expect him to behave like an English gentleman. He's going to expect him to conform to certain rules and certain morals. And of course, this just demonstrates Jonathan's naivety, because this is the way gentlemen, in theory, please, again, this is a generalization and a stereotype. Gentlemen in England were expected to behave in a particular way, but Jonathan's left this civilized England, and he's come across to the uncivilized East, this land of uncertainty, and yet is expecting Dracula to behave in the way that an English gentleman would. I think it's interesting to note that, ironically, Jonathan Harker is there on visiting the Count on 2 levels, primarily as his solicitor, but he's also the guest. So it's going to cause quite an uneasy relationship, because as a host with a guest, you would do everything to look after your host, make your ghost make your guest feel at home. Yet at the same time, Jonathan is there to do a job. He's not the Count's slave, but he is a solicitor, and he's there to do a job. So as we go, you're going to see that it gets a little bit strained, and the relationship's quite difficult to define. But if we go back to the text, Jonathan says, I began to rub my eyes and pinch myself to see if I were awake. So again, it's the suggestion that things are not real. When we are asleep, remember, we are vulnerable. We are not in control. So it's a time when both conscious and unconscious desires can come to the fore. Now, according to Freud, this is the idea that it's when our dreams represent our deepest desires. Other critics believe that that is not the case, but traditionally at night the monsters come out and prey on the weak, hence why obviously children are always scared of monsters in the closet and things like that. And of course it's the idea that in the darkness it's something we don't understand, something we cannot see. So remember, the darkness is not just literal, it's also figurative, in the idea that are we ignorant, and what does ignorance do? So coming into the light is having knowledge, whereas remaining in the dark, we remain ignorant, and what is the impact of that? But it's interesting that Jonathan Harker is beginning to question whether he's awake or asleep. So again, this logical and rational Jonathan, he's saying, I must have been asleep. He's trying to find a rational explanation for what is going on. And therefore, when he does discover it is supernatural, we are more inclined to believe him. And he talks about how he pinches himself, and it's this idea that and the sleep and this recurring motif of sleep is really interesting, and it makes us question how reliable are events. And he says all I could do now was be patient and to wait the coming of the morning. Again, remember, the morning is associated with light, sunshine, so it's the idea that there's nothing he can do in the dark because it's quite scary. There's no answers. But when the morning comes, it's a new, fresh start, new beginning. And the idea that perhaps when he sees things in a different light, maybe they will make more sense. Again, traditionally rational Jonathan. You need to keep reminding yourself throughout this that this is a novel. It is a construct. Stoker wants his audience or his reader to be petrified. And that is why there's this constant questioning and repetition of ideas. It's at this point we now have the introduction of Count Dracula. And if you look, it's a paragraph that starts, just as I had come to this conclusion, I heard a heavy step approaching behind the great door and saw through the chinks the gleam of a coming light. Then there was the sound of rattling chains and the clanking of massive bolts drawn back. A key was turned with the loud grating noise of long disuse, and the great door swung back. Okay, so it's a fabulously gothic arrival. We've got clanking chains. It's almost like stage directions. We've got this wonderful audio, the thunk, the sound. It's dark, it's creepy. The door is seldom used, again, which foreshadows, and the idea that there's a key in the lock, foreshadowing Jonathan later to be locked in the castle. But it's a very effective way of involving the reader and making the reader feel the fear that Jonathan is experiencing. And then we go, within stood a tall old man, clean shaven, save for a long white moustache, and clad in black from head to foot without a single speck of colour. So we've got the idea that he's clean shaven, so it's the civilized, fashionable gentleman. Count Dracula looks the part of the aristocrat. Again, he is clad, however, in black from head to foot. There is no trace of color. Now, black obviously being the color of the villain, and it's very traditional, and the color of night and dark and fear. But the idea that he lacks any color is again twofold. We're looking at physically, if he lacks color, he's extremely pale, and already hinting at the fact that he has no life, that he is undead. But at the same time, color can represent vitality, okay, represent life, represent knowledge, represent understanding. And again, we're looking at this culture conflict between the knowledgeable and scientific and forward-thinking West and the constrained and conservative East, which can't seem to see outside its borders. But so we've got this man who's clearly very wealthy. We've got antique silver. He's got a lamp, it's that and a flame without chimney or globe of any kind. So again, starting to hint at this sense of the Gothic. And we've got quivering shadows, the idea that evil is lurking. Now, just to go back to the idea of Dracula wearing all black, you need to remember that obviously this is a Victorian novel, and Queen Victoria, when her Albert died, she wore black for the rest of her reign. She always wore black. It was a sign of mourning. So one also could look at this and wonder if perhaps the Count is mourning somebody, and it kind of would give us an opportunity to have some pity for him. Obviously that is going to wax and wane as we go through the text, but there is a sense that perhaps he could be mourning someone. Right, he talks in excellent English, but he has a slight intonation. So he has an intonation as an accent, and he says, "Welcome to my house, enter freely and of your own will." Now, this is, I would say, an example of equivocation, because what does it mean? There seems to be this kind of double meaning. It's almost ambiguous here, because enter freely and of your own will, it could be a really pleasant welcoming. Come in, my house is your house, mi casa, su casa, make yourself at home. And it could be this wonderful courtly greeting, this welcome, but at the same time it says, right, it's your choice to come in. Don't blame me for what happens. It's your will. And of course, we, having read the text, know this is again a sense of foreshadowing. Again, notice the instant that I stepped over the threshold, he moved impulsively forward. A constant reminder that Dracula can do nothing until Jonathan Harker crosses the threshold of his own free will. The idea of giving vampires permission. He grasps his hand again with strength that made me wince. So we are reminiscent of the driver. We are beginning to again make links between Dracula and the driver, and describes it that his skin is as cold as ice. So again, the equivocal meaning there is that he physically is really cold, because we know he's not alive, so he doesn't have blood pumping through his system. But it's also the idea of the emotional side of things. And again, if you are looking at it from a psychological perspective, is this man as cold as ice? Has he been made that way emotionally, or is he that way? So has it been because when he was younger there was a lack of love, etc., or is he just naturally, I suppose, a psychopath? Okay, welcome to my house, come freely, go safely, and leave something of the happiness you bring. Note how he is such a courtly gentleman. He's so well mannered, his behavior is very traditional, aristocratic, and the way he speaks when he talks about welcome to my house, come freely, go safely, is old-fashioned. and quite archaic, very, very formal. And it sounds, the way he speaks, as if he's not learned to speak English by interacting with English people, but if he's learned to speak it very formally by reading books. So it's more that idea of kind of formal written English is the way he speaks rather than conversational English. And we do find out later that this is the case. He has learned his English by reading books. So interestingly, because his language choices are grammatically correct and beautifully structured, they're not the kind of structures we would tend to use in conversation. Okay. So he bows courtly, and we realize that he's this wonderful, really well behaved. And as mentioned earlier, he behaves as Jonathan would expect him to behave, as Jonathan would expect an aristocrat to behave. So therefore, Jonathan trusts him. And this is naive on Jonathan's part, obviously. But he does trust him, and perhaps overlook some of the stranger customs which maybe he should have paid attention to. And he says, "I am Dracula, and I bid you welcome, Mr. Harker, to my house. Come in. The night air is chill, and you must need to eat and rest." As he was speaking, he put the lamp on a bracket on the wall, and stepping out took my luggage. He had carried it in before I could forestall him. He's doing the job of a servant. This aristocrat who should have people waiting on him is waiting on Jonathan. It's unheard of. So again, it brings to mind and highlights perhaps the differences between the East and the West. And B, suggests, of course, that he lives alone. And again, we start having, as the reader, we're starting to have these alarm bells going off. Oh my goodness, this man is quite scary. And he says, "No, sir, you are my guest." And as I said earlier, the expectation would be that the Count would wait on Jonathan as his guest, would hold him in high esteem, would make sure he had the best of everything. But again, there's going to be this conflict a little bit later, because at the same time he's going to have to give Jonathan orders as his solicitor. In this paragraph that starts, "Nay, sir, you are my guest," and ends with "freshly replenished, flamed, and flared," that paragraph, please note there's a use of alliteration and sibilance. It's the idea of this creating this atmosphere, this almost cathedral-like atmosphere where everything's quiet and people speak in hushed tones. Jonathan Harker's really happy to be there. He thinks it's wonderful. He says he rejoiced about the well-lit room, but there's this sense of looming danger. And as we go on, and it talks again, "The Count halted, putting down my bags, closed the door, opened another door, opened another door." Okay, notice the constant repetition of the word door. Okay, and traditionally and metaphorically in literature, door is the implication when you close and open a door, it's the entering and transitioning from one world to another. Now, obviously, Jonathan is transitioning from the east to the west, the west to the east, west to east in terms of culture, but he's also going from real life and reality and the real world, and he's transcending to the world of the supernatural. He is going to therefore go through this door, and there's, as you go through, note the constant use of doors in this text in terms of transition, and the idea that the Count closes the door and opens the next door and locks doors keeps hinting that Jonathan is going to be a prisoner. Again, notice how Stoker also uses the adjective great, as in this great thing was happening. So he uses it as an adjective to be positive, yay, that's great, as well as huge. Again, something to think about. Why would he be using that particular adjective regularly throughout the text? He says, the Count goes to Jonathan, "You will need after your journey to refresh yourself by making your toilet. Please remember that in Victorian society, Toilet was your getting ready and getting sorted. That's where the word comes from. You'd go into the room with a toilet. It doesn't mean you just go to the loo. It would mean you washed up, cleaned your teeth, changed your clothes, etc. Okay. And he does genuinely shows the idea that he is a great host. You'll have all you wish. He's giving him this opportunity. And I think from this point, we need to realize, keep making a note as we go through, how does Harker describe the Count at this stage? Because it's going to change by the end of this chapter. So notice as we go through this, the initial explanation. And he describes him as courteous and welcome, and it says it's dissipated all my doubts and fears because he is behaving. So Jonathan is naive enough to not even consider that manners can conceal evil. He's not thinking, wow, this guy is I need to be a bit wary of this guy because maybe he's hiding something. He takes it at face value. He trusts the Count because of the way he behaves and because of his generous behavior. And as we go through, you are going to see how he describes the Count. Victorians put great stock in physiognomy, which is someone's facial features and expression and how they were indicative of personality. So, for example, if your eyes are too close together, that obviously means you are a sneaky weasel and you're likely to be a criminal. And in fact, books have been written on how Victorians would use physiognomy to determine who were criminals. So if you were unfortunate enough to have an odd facial feature, then you were scuppered. But just so note, when we go through the great descriptions of him, note how they always seem, Jonathan always uses a lot of physical language. And he goes on to say that he had, Dracula says, I pray you be seated and sup. And again, just a constant reminder, to sup is to eat, to have supper. It's again an archaic term and reminds us that Jonathan has gone from one world to another. All right. He hands him a letter and says one passage, and there we go on and says, one passage of it at least gave me a thrill of pleasure. So he sat down, he's handed the Count this letter, and he's quite excited when the Count reads this letter because, of course, he's a typically human individual. And obviously, his boss, Jonathan Harker's boss, has written something very positive in this letter and saying, look, I've sent you Harker. He's an amazing solicitor. I trust him completely. He's the guy who'll do your job. That's what we assume because Jonathan is clearly excited. A human. He's proud of his accomplishments. And he's not boasting, but he's just really quite like, ooh, yay, chuffed. And it again makes him more likable to the reader. He's not completely without flaw. We realize he's naive. We realize he's got pride in himself. And that makes him more believable and more likable. And because we identify with him and because we empathize with him and because we understand him, we're more, again, likely to believe what he says. The Count's excuse for not partaking in the meal is gout. Gout's a type of arthritis that causes inflammation and is caused by uric acid in the joint. So it's quite a valid reason. However, we know that it's because he consumes blood. Blood is what he eats and drinks. So it's not. Gout is just a very interesting excuse. And he says he regrets this. And he says, I'm happy to say I send a sufficient substitute, one of whom I have every possible confidence. And he's foreshadowing all of this. He talks about, we've got this paragraph that foreshadows Count Dracula's regression to the young man. He's talking about how, he needs someone who's discreet because he obviously his ideas and thoughts and the way he wants things done are a little bit strange. But remember, as a reader, we are expected to make judgments based on what we are reading. We do not get to see the entire thing at this point. We need to take out from what Jonathan's saying, and we need to be able to read between the lines. Again, Jonathan goes into great detail about the excellent roast chicken, cheese and salad, etc., etc. So he spends a lot of time talking about the food, but he doesn't make reference to the questions that the Count asks. Again, think about that. What could Stoker be suggesting? Please remember again, the questions about his journeys again are a metaphor in literature, and the idea of growth and development and movement from one aspect of life to another, which again is representative of Jonathan. And once he's finished, he describes the Count in terms of his physiognomy. And the physiognomy that he describes gives the impression that the Count is a strong and forceful character. Victorian reader would have known this. He seems to be a man of contradictions. He's pale yet ruddy, but he is a strong, dominant alpha male. And it says he had an aquiline nose associated with a high bridge, and thin, which is associated with the aristocracy. It talks about his forehead and his hair. It talks about his eyebrows. It talks about the moustache. It says his chin was broad and strong, and all of these are associated with strength. Okay, strength of character, perhaps even stubbornness. He also says about how the palms of his hands were hairy. And again, this is, if you remember right at the beginning, he said the words for vampire and werewolf were very, very similar. Again, what is Stoker suggesting here? The nails were long and fine and cut to a sharp point. So, and it says, he says he could not repress a shudder. It may have been his breath was rank, but a horrible feeling of nausea came over me. So it's the idea that even if Jonathan does not realize that there's consciously that there is something wrong with the Count, subconsciously he is getting the heebie-jeebies, and of course this is significant. So again, the idea of the werewolf and the constant repetition and reference to wolves that are howling. Please note that the Count refers to them as the children of the night. Okay, it implies he's perhaps their parent. He's like these creatures. He is a hunter. He hunts his prey. He stalks. Perhaps he's able to identify the wolves. He clearly is able to control the wolves, and because of this, he compares their howling to music, which seems a bit strange. So he's this, again, hinting at the supernatural, the idea that he has control over these wild animals, which again shows that he is wild of nature. And his quote where he says, "Ah, sir, you dwellers in the city cannot enter into the feelings of the hunter," highlighting this idea of the whole theme of civilized versus uncivilized, the idea of being in control and lacking control. A very interesting comment. At first glance, oh, it's just conversational. Oh, well, don't worry about the howling wolves. It's very difficult for city people to understand what it's like living in the country. But when you look at it again, is it perhaps a warning? And is he not saying to Jonathan, city dweller, you don't understand me, the hunter? So give that some thought. Again, we've got the whole sleep, and he tells him to sleep well and dream well, and this motif is running out throughout. As we move on, we see the 7th of May, so we've now been in the castle for 3 days. Okay, he is talking about the idea that he doesn't see the Count during the day. What happens is they talk all night, and he doesn't seem to suggest that this is odd, but everywhere he goes, there's nobody there. So again, Stoker's reminding us that Jonathan is alone, he's isolated, typical Gothic trope, and he has clear descriptions, etc., and tell us exactly what's going on, the table services of gold, etc., etc. If things are cozy and costly and beautiful, implies that he's clearly rational. He is not just exhibiting signs of insanity. He is able to be very rational and sane in his descriptions. But interestingly, he says this is the one thing he does find surprising. In none of the rooms is there a mirror. Okay, now according to Eastern European folklore, creatures like vampires don't have a soul. And if you don't have a soul, you cannot cast a shadow and you cannot have a reflection. So that it's very interesting as you see how Stoker is just popping in these little tidbits on how to identify and deal with vampires. As we go, you'll see that comes up as well. But again, in terms of the metaphor, the idea is that the mirror reflects the true character. So if, of course, he has a reflection, the image is going to be grotesque and monstrous because Dracula is a monster. Again, the door opposite mine I tried but found it locked, hinting at the fact that Jonathan is already a prisoner, despite the fact he hasn't worked it out yet. Okay, so he goes and spends a lot of time in the library, where he discovers a number of English books on England and English life and customs and manners. And this is what shows us that the Count is clearly very knowledgeable. This is the impression that we get. This is where he has learned language, not from experience, but obviously through reading all these books about England and English life and customs and manners. The books are very varied. There's history, geography, politics, political economy, botany, geology, law, everything. He's clearly a very well-read man, and the implication therefore is that he's also highly intelligent. All right. Now, a Victorian audience or Victorian reader would have also associated this, that the Victorians were known for being scientists and explorers. And of course, scientific discovery was really very, very important. And again, we've got the contrast about how some of these scientists and explorers got to go out and experience these different cultures. And perhaps Jonathan represents the ability to go out and live it, while the Count has to experience it through books. And again, maybe that is the bulk of the population in England. Again, something for you to think about. But we the reader realize as we go through this section and the conversation they have, and how the Count says, I want you to stay and help me to learn English, we realize that Jonathan, again in his naivety, hasn't worked out that there's an ulterior motive. He's not just there to finalize property contracts. He is not just there to get the Count to sign things. The Count has ulterior motives, and he is using Jonathan to help prepare him for his move to the modern world. If we want to be melodramatic, he's using him as his tool to help prepare him for his world domination. Okay. The fact that Jonathan is making constant reference to the ideas of fear and unease gives the reader the impression that this man, Jonathan, is dispensable. As soon as he is no longer needed, the Count is going to get rid of him permanently. He is not ever going to leave this castle. The irony of this is that Harker is completely oblivious. He trusts the Count, again, because of his status and because of his gentlemanly manners, and because he is naive enough not to have ever experienced this kind of behavior, and therefore expects that we've got this person who is going to be very positive, very gentlemanly. There's no ulterior motive. Again, as we go through, notice the use of the word doors. They talk, and Jonathan wants to know why. How can he help the Count? And the Count says, talks about, well, I know that, did I move and speak in your London, none there are who would not know me for a stranger. That is not enough for me. Here I am noble. The common people know me, and I am master. Now, a modern audience might frown on this. This is, archaic. Again, a Victorian audience would not have been shocked by this because, of course, we have a social hierarchy. And in feudal situations, which Transylvania was, we've got the idea of the aristo being in charge, and the peasants doing what he's told. This man is master. He's master of the peasants. He's master of the animals. This man is in control. The common people know me, he says, and clearly fear him. So he's clearly accustomed to being this powerful and known, important character in his own country. And he says, but a stranger in a strange land is no one. So does it imply that he realizes that if he moves, and he moves to England, he is going to be a nobody, because he's not known, he hasn't got the reputation that precedes him, he's going to have to re-establish himself. So perhaps this is suggesting that there is a limit to Dracula's power. What is he trying to do? Why is he leaving Transylvania? Is he trying to expand his power base? What is he up to? And of course, this also highlights to us how important power is to this man. And if he wants to take over the world, then he needs to be able to blend in. He cannot stand out. He cannot be looked upon as somebody who's odd and stands out, because then he will become untrustworthy. He needs to be able to catch people unawares. He needs people to trust him. So if he doesn't blend, he will be unsuccessful. And in order for him to blend, he needs to know how to behave appropriately. Because remember, people automatically distrust strangers. Okay. And notice, as Count Dracula speaks to Jonathan, we are very aware that they are from two different social strata. So, of course, Dracula is the count, he's the aristo, his manner is imperious, and he's commanding. He is Jonathan's social superior. Okay, so Jonathan is at a bit of a disadvantage because he is his social superior, and of course, Dracula is his boss. But although he is employed, he is the solicitor, he's not a servant or a slave. He's an educated gentleman. So again, this highlights the theme of old tradition versus new ideas, and perhaps suggests that sometimes there's going to be conflict between the two, and we have to find a way to meld them. And the Count goes on and says, we're in Transylvania, and Transylvania is not England. Our ways are not your ways. Forewarning. He is saying to Jonathan very clearly that my behavior is going to be alien to you. He hints at the idea of the supernatural by talking about strange things, and is clearly very, very astute. He is in control of the conversation. He shifts the topics. He determines the topics. This is a man in control. Okay. Jonathan's clearly unaware of the danger he's in, and he asks about the traditions of the country, and it talks about the blue flames that he saw when he was en route to the castle. Again, the blue flame is hints at the supernatural, the idea of blue being ghostly and otherworldly, but also shows the theme of scientific rationality versus folklore and superstition. And what happens is we get this discussion, and Dracula talks about what goes on. He gives this hint. We haven't yet got to his history. That comes a little bit later, but he hints at what's going on. His explanations clearly demonstrate that he has an aristocratic outlook. Because your peasant is at heart a coward, and he's got this aristocratic outlook, and he behaves accordingly. He doesn't think very highly of peasants. He feels they are cowards and fools. And interestingly, he is honest. He comes out and says that. Whereas Jonathan, perhaps, is not honest. And because if you read his stuff, remember when he spoke about the woman and the peasants on the journey, he was quite patronizing in a way. So it's the idea that perhaps he also thinks that the peasants are beneath him, but he doesn't come right out and say it. So it's really, is he going to be, he's clearly not as overt with his opinions, but maybe at heart he really is somebody who is, thinks he is better than others. And it goes on, and Dracula talks of the country's turbulent, violent history, and the way he does, he seems to enjoy it. It talks about things being enriched by the blood of man, and it just adds that this whole idea that he's almost like a caged animal. I get the impression of him pacing and stalking up and down like somebody who's desperate to escape any chance, and getting to England is going to be his chance, any chance to escape and wreak havoc. He's really on tenterhooks. Again, notice how when Jonathan describes him having canine teeth, links to him being a dog, wolf animal. And again, focus on the doors. So the relationship, I think, between Harker and the Count is quite difficult to define, because where are the boundaries? Remember, boundaries are really, really important, and establishing boundaries are important. And boundaries are of, there's two varieties. You've got the country boundaries, but determining one country from another, but you've also got the idea of emotional boundaries, so knowing when to stop or knowing when to cease, etc., etc. And I think the consequence of this relationship is there's going to be the crossing of two different boundaries. Obviously, he's going to be moving from Transylvania to England, but we've also got the idea that he's going to cross the boundary of his class, and he's not picky about who he attacks. As we go, Jonathan discusses the house at Purfleet that has been acquired for Count Dracula, describes it as dilapidated, surrounded by a high wall, ancient structure, built of heavy stones. Again, Stoker using a traditional Gothic setting. It's this fortress that's crumbling. Again, the idea that even in England, this modern society, feudal system is not necessarily going to be successful. Also, the idea that the power that Dracula has in Transylvania is crumbling now, but when he goes to England, it is not strong enough to be sustained. It's surrounded by a high wall, so it's this fortress. It's walled off from the world. It's the sense of isolation. It's a conventional Gothic ruin. It's the estate of Purfleet is named Carfax, and it's this traditional Gothic ruin. And it's got it's a quatre face, so it's got four sides, and it's just very block-like. All the high walls and the heavy stones there to keep Dracula in or to keep people out. Again, it's very large, it's very old, it's medieval, and if you explore again, it's a traditional Gothic setting, so do have a look at that. Interestingly, though, Count Dracula is now starting to talk. Well, when he responds to Jonathan and his description, it seems like he's almost taunting him. He's actually giving Jonathan some of his weaknesses and ways to defeat him, because he says things like he doesn't like bright sunshine. Okay, well, of course, vampires are night creatures. They're nocturnal. They cannot cope with the sun. He doesn't like sparkling water. Now, again, traditionally, vampires cannot cross running water. Okay, so he's giving these little hints and tips to Jonathan. It's almost like he's mocking him. And he goes on to say, he says, I love the shade and the shadow. So not only does he like the dark, but it's the idea of the evil and the metaphor there. And it says, somehow his words and his look did not seem to accord. So what he says and the way and his facial expression while he says it don't match up. And in fact, his smile comes across as malignant and saturnine, which is dark and gloomy. And Jonathan, again, in his naivety, does not realize that this count is cruel and cold and evil. All right. If you asked him, he would probably think it's a trick of the light. So let's move on, and we get to the 8th of May. And again, he says, I began to fear as I wrote in this book being his journal, and he cannot help but feel uneasy. So even if the man is unaware, overtly unaware of how Dracula is making him feel, there is certainly the sense of foreboding and the suggestion that something horrible is going to come. And notice how it's drawn out. So there's this constant foreshadowing and this constant suggestion that something's going to happen, but at the moment it's not happening, and it's this, it's quite creepy. All right. Again, notice how he talks about sleeping. He says, I slept a few hours, and this constant reference to sleep. And the motif of sleep it reoccurs. Now we get the situation where he's shaving, and the Count comes up behind him, and Jonathan cannot see his reflection in the mirror, and the Count it kind of gets this horrible expression on his face and is only put off by the crucifix. So again, we've got the idea of religious symbols. So we've got this disconcerting incident here. Okay, we realize Stoker is using this chapter to establish various aspects and ideas about vampires. So instead of coming out overtly and saying it, he's dropping little hints and little tidbits. So what we've learned up until this point is that Count Dracula is nocturnal, doesn't like the sun, has no reflection. Blood alters his behavior, because as you see, when Jonathan cuts himself, he becomes this manic individual, the Count, and he's halted by religious symbols. Okay, and there seems to be this repressed, and again, think back to that the statement I made about how it's this caged animal. There seems to be this repressed fury, and then the Count says, well, take care, be careful not to hurt yourself or cut yourself, and then throws his mirror out of the window. And although he puts on this gentlemanly manner, there's something not right. And Jonathan is starting to feel a little bit scared. He realizes, I think, that my ways are not your ways is certainly coming to the fore. I think Count Dracula certainly threatens Jonathan's notions and ideas of what is supposed to be civilized, what is supposed to be restraint, people's duty. And of course, Jonathan needs to put all of this together, but because he's experiencing it in drips and drabs, perhaps he is not putting it all together. The chapter ends with the statement, the castle is a veritable prison and I am a prisoner. Finally, Jonathan realizes that he is a prisoner. He describes the beauty of the castle, he describes the beauty of the scenery, and the harshness of the situation that he is a prisoner is in direct contrast to what is going on outside. He has to look at the outside through a window because he's cut off from the rest of the world, and I think this just serves to highlight that.